collective climate change responses depends on the individual, right? So climate change inaction means that one person doesn't have to change. All right, I lived, I survived. Climate change inaction means that a person doesn't have to change the car they drive. Climate change inaction by a company means that they do not have to spend money on reducing the carbon emissions in their manufacturing. Climate change inaction by a government means that government doesn't have to spend money on transitioning to green energy, right? So there's this sense of like individual burden for a collective need, right? And then thirdly, economists have this term called discounting the future. And discounting the future means that for some people, the future feels abstract. It's uncertain, right? But the present isn't abstract. It's not uncertain. We know it right now. And so discounting the future means some people say to themselves, who knows what's going to happen? Let's just see. So one of the explanations I've read that always stayed with me is discounting the future is why it's so hard for some people to put money in a savings account. It's really difficult, right? Because you feel financial needs today, and who knows if you'll still have those financial needs in the future. So it's hard to put money in a savings account, right? However, when we consider where we are in June 2022, I think it's become clear that the long term is no longer long term, it's today. The individual is no longer individual in action. It is by definition collective in its impacts. And that our climate change savings account at the bank is below the required minimum balance. So no one feels these impacts of climate change more acutely than vulnerable women and girls across the world, including vulnerable women and girls in the Commonwealth. However, employing a gender-responsive approach to climate change policy is separate from, but it cannot be guaranteed through, simply improved representation of women in climate change decision-making. Instead, we have to examine the quality of and the support for that women's representation. So today we are delivering a call to action. This climate change panel is very solutions-oriented. We aim to highlight the impacts of climate change on women and girls, particularly the initiatives and the measures being delivered, gender mainstreamed funding, and the importance of more inclusive leadership. So this morning, we have two solutions-oriented objectives that we will explore. You can consider it as like a problem-solution format. First, we're going to look at specific vulnerabilities of women and girls across the Commonwealth at the grassroots level, the lived everyday experiences. Then, in response to that, we are going to examine women and girls as empowered agents of change at both the micro and the macro level. So we're hoping to link the micro and the macro. The session will emphasize the provision of actual real-world initiatives which have already seen impacts and successes. So anyone in attendance, you are welcome to share your success stories during the Q&A. That's really what we want to hear most. Thank you so much. So on your left, joins us from the Seychelles, where she is member of the National Assembly and chair of the Seychelles Women Caucus, Center of Excellence in Biodiversity, and my work focuses on the gender dynamic. So we will begin with Mr. Nair has a slide deck presentation.
this all-important subject of today. Let me take the shortcut of using some slides, but definitely would like to use it just to keep the point of discussion loud and clear. I'm just trying to move the slides. Yeah, here you go. Okay. So, as all of you know, the climate change and gender is an important area of work that the Commonwealth Secretariat is leading as part of the major work stream on climate and gender. So, climate and gender is definitely a growing area, and as our moderator talked and also our speakers introduced, it's still an area which requires a lot of interventions, a lot of support, a lot of policies, and we are day in and day out experiencing it in our member countries where we are working. So my idea is to give some tangible examples from the ground in terms of what we have learned and of course what we are doing in this space of work. So as Ms. Lane pointed out, the financing requirements currently is below the required minimum balance that is needed to act. And let me start from there. So the Commonwealth has what we call our flagship initiative, the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. So this was a mandate provided to us from CHOGM 2015, where we were given the mandate to support member countries with access to finance. So we've been in that space of work since 2016 and have been supporting many of our member countries. So we are currently, I don't know whether the slides are visible, but we are currently served around 16 member countries in various aspects of climate finance, from policy support to capacity development to institutional structuring and of course knowledge management. So what is required right now for enhanced action is enabling policies which are oriented towards the requirements of the country. We also need institutions to be geared up to act, and of course the institutional capacities as well as human capacities. And when we look at financial instruments, I was talking to some of the co-panelists in the morning. The financial instruments are currently not customized to meet the gender inclusion requirements, which is the most important aspect in terms of working on multiple sectors like water, agriculture, etc. So which we are trying to do. And of course, development of project proposals of scale and having transformative impact, that's also going to be a game changer when it comes to implementing these activities in the ground. We can definitely talk about this. But when we talk about the minimum bank balance, which is basically the lack of climate finance, that's one side of the story that we are talking about. But on the other hand, the extent of utilization of this climate finance for the benefit of the vulnerable communities, that's also under question, that how well countries are able to utilize this money and how effectively they can turn around these project proposals following the standards that are set at international level is questionable. And our role as Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub is to support member countries in taking this process forward, mirroring the requirements, and of course this is being done by placing national and regional climate finance advisors in the member countries and to support this initiative. So we are currently present in 16 member countries, and thanks to the great support provided by the government of Mauritius in setting up the, so I see the Honorable Head of State present here, and so would like to thank the government of Mauritius for accommodating the hub and supporting the hub since 2016, and we have been like doing this work since then. Okay, so as I said, like we work on 5 important areas like policy and strategy development, project development, capacity building and knowledge management, and advocacy. So just moving on to some examples, for a country like Eswatini, having no gender policy till now, so we've like supported in developing and giving a kind of a roadmap in terms of how to look at gender policies from the climate action perspective at the ground level, at the grassroots level, and also to look at how the grassroots institutions and also the governance structures are oriented to give this kind of an access to finance and also to develop the policies in the country. And similarly, sorry, it's taking time to move. Yeah. So in the Caribbean, we've supported in developing a readiness proposal, which is basically very transformative. It's small amount of money, but we did develop a readiness project for the government of Jamaica to set up a kind of a gender responsive facility from the Green Climate Fund. So basically that helps to respond to the gender requirements for the member country in terms of setting up adaptation and mitigation linked projects there and also institutional structure. Yeah. So another major work that we did in terms of building the capacities is again to now a lot of entrepreneurial ventures coming up in the green financing space. We also see that there are enabling policies in many of our member countries to deal with this, and it's a positive sign, but still to be done. So need for increased capacity and technical assistance. As I said, the banking system is still not geared up to integrate this kind of customized financial requirements. So we need a lot of capacities to link the green financing and the gender mainstreaming efforts together, because that requires policy changes, that requires institutional changes, etc. So that's an area of support that we based on our experience have found that requires a lot of attention, and scaled up and targeted gender specific climate change project is something which is a need of an hour. So currently gender is an element in some of our project proposals, but we need very specific interventions at scale to ensure that this creates a transformational impact. So definitely, before I end, I think we should treat this with great significance, and in the run up to COP27 we definitely will be working with our member countries to support this all important initiative. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nair, and I hope that we can circle back to the discussion of hubs during the Q&A session. That was really helpful. And our next presenter will be Dr. Maliha Khan with Women Deliver.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank the Women's Forum for inviting us to talk about this really important issue, and for inviting me to come and talk about this role of girls and women in leadership, and the role of sexual reproductive health and climate change and the connections between them. So I'll start by doing a little bit of a reset about the ways that we think about climate change. We think about climate change as a sort of a global issue, looking at the planet. We think about it as a systems issue. We think about large systems and the impact that climate change is having on water systems or oceans or land systems. And if we come down to the lowest level, we tend to go down to maybe the household. Most experts tend to think of households, tend to think of the impact of climate change on households and the ways that households cope and adapt and react to climate change. They also tend to take households as undifferentiated wholes. Right? They don't look at the different people within the household and the differentiated impact that various climate change stresses and shocks can have on the household. So rather than talk about climate change and gender, I just wanted to talk about girls and women and climate change, and making it very, very real. Think about the individual and how climate change and the various shocks and stresses that come with it affect them. And we can sort of hide a lot of the real impacts and dehumanize almost the process by talking in very technical terms. And of course we have technical terms to talk about it, but I think that if we start to think about, say, the impact of and one of the most recent, I think, big climate stresses that we saw recently was the heat stress in South Asia. And we've got two South Asians here on the panel, so we can talk about it. Temperatures reaching over 50 degrees Celsius in many parts of North India and Pakistan. and the temperatures remain that high for over a month. And someone said something very interesting when they were talking about that. They said, this is going to be the lowest, highest temperature we're ever going to see. So think about that. So if it was 52 degrees, that's going to be the lowest, highest temperature. It's only going to go up from here. So when you think about girls and women and the stress that they are facing in those communities where the temperatures are going over 50 degrees centigrade, that's where you really start to think about how is it affecting them. So why girls and women, and talking about climate change? Well, they're the people who contribute the least, particularly the poor and vulnerable girls and women, contribute the least to climate change and suffer the most. And that's something to keep in mind as we go forward with this. Why do they suffer the most? Well, they have the most institutional barriers to developing their climate change resilience. They tend to have less education, they tend to have less access to financial resources, they tend to have less access to transportation of various sorts, less ability to have alternative economic avenues and ways and income sources. They tend to get less information. We know we're starting to think about the digital divide and how an adolescent girl is 1/3 less likely to have access to digital technology than an adolescent boy is. That also means that she's getting less information and has less ability to communicate. And if you think about the ways that you're able to build resilience in the face of climate change shocks and stresses, all of these factors, having alternative income sources, being able to access transportation, being able to access information, having leadership positions and being able to make decisions, are all attributes of what makes a person more resilient to a climate change shock and stress. So they tend to have less of those, and that's why they get affected more. But on top of all of that, a lot of the negative impacts of climate change and the coping strategies that many states use or communities use or households use also tends to come down on the negative in terms of girls and women, particularly those that are poor and vulnerable. Their gendered roles means they have more reproductive tasks that they're responsible for. And as you start to face more and more shocks and stresses, your care responsibilities go up. Imagine what these women in North India and Pakistan were going through when temperatures, were reaching 50 degrees centigrade, and the household sort of care responsibilities went up, the access to water went up, the abilities to access it went down, and all of these things, these were having, very severe implications for them. In addition to that, when you have a severe shock, a flood, a drought, something that requires movement of the households, the women's access to health resources, well, everyone's access to health services goes down, but women's access to health services goes down even more. And their access to sexual reproductive health services, the full suite of them, which is very, very important, also goes down, and that becomes really problematic. In addition to that, we know that research shows us that household coping strategies and community coping strategies in the face of these shocks and stresses that are becoming increasing often, again, come down on the girl child. First person that's pulled out of school when a household doesn't have enough income tends to be the girl child. We know that in many contexts, early marriage of girls is a coping strategy in the face of stresses and shocks because the household wants to get the girls out of the household and safe. So again, all the negative implications start to go there. So what can we do to sort of start to change that? We have a number of things that we should be thinking about. One, we know that shocks and stresses due to climate change are not going to go down anytime soon. We're increasingly going to be facing long-term shocks and stresses, particularly the slow onslaught ones. There's going to be increasing heat stress. There's going to be increasing scarcity of water. Or there's going to be increasing numbers of floods. So you either have too much water, or you have too little water, or it's too hot. It's essentially what climate change is doing. And so all of those are going to start to have those impacts. The one thing you have to do in the face of this, as you try to mitigate climate change on one hand, is you have to increase the resilience of poor and vulnerable communities to absorb and adapt and transform in the face of climate change. If you don't do that, then the poor communities and the individuals and the households within those are going to just spiral down. Every time they face a stress or a shock, their economic status, their ability to face the next shock or stress that comes along is just going to keep going down and down and down. And so you have to increase that, and we know that the ways that you're able to do that are making sure that you've got policies that address women and girls specifically. Make sure that financing, and you spoke about that, which is so important, financing is being directed at initiatives that specifically focus on girls and women and their specific needs, not on communities or households at large. And you've got to have them at the table to make the decisions. Someone at the plenary yesterday said something really interesting that they'd heard at the youth forum. And I was going to say the nothing about us without us. So, if it's going to affect girls and women, then they should be at the table. But I liked what they said yesterday, and I don't remember who said it, so I'm not going to quote it. But it should just be nothing without us. Right? So, women and girls should be present in terms of decision making on climate change because they're half of the population. And currently, we know they're starkly absent in this debate, and that's got to change. One thing I will say, though, that often we frame the inclusion of girls and women into various issues, be it conflict or whatever it is, and certainly that's true for climate change, as the saviors. They're not the saviors. We should never look to them to suddenly be the saviors for climate change. They should be there because their needs and wants should be considered, and they should be there because they have a right to be there. We should be there because we have a right to be there, but never considering them as suddenly, if you have a female leader, although there are studies that show that actually you get better climate change decisions if you have more female leadership. But you shouldn't be looking at female leadership just in terms of, well, you're going to have you're going to have better climate change decisions and results that are going to be coming from that. So I'll conclude with a few recommendations that we've been thinking about and talking about, and that's coming from a coalition that's working on this. One is you have to have gender responsive funding, and you spoke so eloquently about that and the ways that can be done. And I think that, the one thing that I took from your thing is that there's just not enough of it, right? You spoke about, small initiative. We can't have small billion-dollar initiatives that are, just gender responsive funding. And these have to be new and additional and not the relabeling, which is what often happens, particularly when we do sort of gender budgeting. They just go through the budget and say, well, can we call that gender? Can we call that gender? Can we call that gender? And then they come up and they roll all the sums up and say, well, here you go. This is our gender responsive funding of this issue. So it has to be new and it has to be additional. You have to increase ODA towards that. That's a commitment and a call to the funding community. And the funding should be going directly to women-led or women-focused organizations. Again, because you have the systems that don't think about this in meaningful ways. You have to have meaningful participation of feminist movements and feminist leaders from across the globe that are sitting at the table. And that's really important. Getting down to specifically the nexus between sexual reproductive health, and I can talk about that a bit later, but one of the recommendations is that you have to make sure that you are climate proofing sexual reproductive health and rights. And that's in two areas. One is you have to make health systems more climate change resilient. And we know that health systems suffer hugely when you have shocks and stresses. It's one of the systems that goes down. Making sure you have those, making sure that you're including a full suite of sexual reproductive health services in any emergency response to a climate change shock. It tends to be one of the things that gets left out. Emergency responses tend not to have those health services included in it, and we know that that's when the women and girls are the most vulnerable and they need them the most. And that not having them actually makes them more vulnerable to climate change shocks and stresses going forward. Lastly, I'll again make just one last plug, which is, let us never think about sexual reproductive health services as a mitigation strategy around climate change. People put that forward in different guises. One of the ones I find particularly distressing is when they say the sixth best thing you can do for climate change is to educate a girl. First of all, a girl should be educated because she has a right to be educated. But we know that the sort of hidden message behind that is, well, if you educate a girl, then her fertility goes down. If your fertility goes down, then population goes down, and therefore that's a climate change mitigation strategy. And that to me is deeply problematic, because women and girls should be provided with bodily autonomy. It should be coming from a social justice and rights approach and not from a mitigation approach. So I think there's a danger of conflating the two, and we need to make sure that we keep those apart as we start to discuss these things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. And during the Q&A, I'll circle back. You just covered so many topics that for a lot of us, they might seem unrelated, but you link them so beautifully in this tapestry to show the interconnectedness among social justice issues. So thank you. And our third speaker on this panel is the Honorable Regina Esperin, joining us from the Seychelles.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As it has been said, my name is Honorable Regina Esperin, Member of Parliament from Seychelles, Chairperson of the Women's Caucus. And recently I was elected as the Chairperson of the RWPC, Regional Women Parliamentary Caucus, for SADC-PF. To start with, let me thank the organization for inviting me to share knowledge from our beautiful island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Let me say that all countries, including small island states as ours, are not spared from natural catastrophe, and people are always at the center of this natural disaster, which together with climate changes often deepen existing inequality and equity, including gender-based discrimination, with women and girls oftentimes considered as the most vulnerable group in various aspects of life. Generally, in many countries, us women are characteristically more susceptible than men, and we are more often affected by consequences of natural disasters and climate changes. This comes as a result of not only our physical makeup, but also as a direct result of our socio-economic disparity and unbalanced power. Consequently, depending on our geographic location and culture, millions of us women and girls have been given very little attention, and also none at all, or no consideration has been given on our role as powerful agents in pre- and post-disaster activity, be it natural or man-made. And research has shown that when disaster strikes on a global scale, women and children are more affected socially and economically, and also in respect of loss of livelihood and lives. The disaster itself does not discriminate, but it is in a manner that us, as human beings, respond to those situations that leads to this difficult socio-economic outcome. Yes, we ought to realize how important it is to take into consideration the aspect of gender perspective when working on disaster risk management, and most importantly, resilience building. We have to first and foremost understand the importance of resilience, how to become resilient in the face of adversity, and why it is imperative in disaster risk management. When we are resilient, we are better able to anticipate the occurrence of disaster, and hence better able to prepare ourselves to manage their outcome and sometimes faster to recover. When in a state of readiness, it allows for better planning to protect lives, which considerably decreases damage and losses from these calamities and protect the ecosystem. It should be seen as a process rather than simply an outcome, compromising of knowledge, building adjustment, expectancy, growth in elementary structure, participation, and rules. So, ladies and gentlemen, fostering resilience should therefore consist of guidelines, procedures, and training that improve those threats, and one method is to start with effective risk management to deliver an all-inclusive program to evaluate schemes and their communication from the domestic life to nationwide. And this is what my country, Seychelles, has embarked on. We were the first country in Africa to develop and maintain a disaster fund since 2013 by using contingent credit, and this gave us necessary relief to begin formulating our risk management framework, including disaster risk profile, which has enabled us to access the development policy loan, which allowed our country to build resilience to disastrous events impacting on our economic and its citizens. With creation of our management body, which has the mandate to give advice that will mitigate and prevent disaster, and recently, last week, it has launched its website to create awareness and educate the public at large. Seeing that present tendency are showing us that the world is increasingly becoming more vulnerable to climate changes, with the catastrophe becoming more widespread and more impactful, resilience is indeed imperative in disaster risk management. And as a small island state with low-lying islands, we would not be spared of the danger that is looking at us in the eyes. For this particular reason, it is no longer time for us women to sit back and let men alone make decisions that impact everyone, including women. Our voices should be heard, yes, louder than that of the men. As a political activist, Stella Nyanzi from neighborhood country Uganda once said, "Women can shape the world for the better." Yes, women can make a difference in mitigating the effect of climate changes, if only we are included at the decision-making level. I would rather say, if the effect of climate change is having a negative impact on us, women, be part of the solution. Let us be agents of change, and we should support the initiative of a gender-responsive budgeting when it comes to climate change. As the most affected and least heard, both women and children should be allowed to actively participate in decision-making process. Inclusion would lessen disaster risk, and awareness changes the way we see natural disaster. It simply means that countries around the world need to recognize the pivotal role of women and children in disaster risk prevention and community resilience program. This is the only way we can achieve considerable decreases in disaster mortality, plus damage in critical infrastructure, and disruption to basic services such as health and education facilities. For instance, gender inequality can hinder how women and girls react to decisions governing their life and those of their family. Hence, gender inequality remains a main impediment to human advancement. It is high time that women and children are valued, with women assuming leadership position and becoming agents of change, instead of just seen as a vulnerable group or disaster victim. At the community level, disaster risk prevention can even begin with boys and girls at school. Success stories have been documented in countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, to name a few, showing the effect of including women, girls, and children and the youth in the disaster risk preparedness. Children has effectively contributing in mapping hazards, raising awareness through radio program and games, and influencing other children, teachers, parents, and community on how to reduce disaster risk. In Seychelles, we have school clubs showcasing nature conservation and environment protection, mostly led by female teachers. At the Parliament, we have environment club being led by a woman. We generate most of our electricity from photovoltaic, and we harvest rainwater for mostly every use in the building, watering plant, washing and everything. We have become a paperless institution for most of our operation. And the creation of a multi-sectoral committee to overlook at climate change, agriculture, and outlying island is being set up, and in the near future, it would be on its feet. Director for Environment Program is a woman who champions nature conservation. It is high time the world recognize the huge potential of women and their genuine involvement and hardship in disaster risk reduction, and their frequency, exceptional role in the resilience building, disaster response, and recovery. It also goes to note that women are often primary respondents during disaster, taking care of their families and communities, while also dealing with the adverse impact on their livelihood and possession. We play a vigorous role in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery effort. So recognizing and validating our role involvement can have positive outcomes on results, as well as influential positive effect on our position in the community for us community leaders. As often disaster recoveries present women with prospects to showcase their worth, breaking down the constraints that they face. The role we play in our family and community, in health and education and childcare, and also work outside home should be seen, recognized, and resourced. It is time to close the gap in gender if we are to strengthen our resilience, preparedness, coping capacity, and recovery effort. Offsetting the trend is indeed possible if we are committed. Awarding additional significance to gender standpoint is a must if we are to start developing and building links, linking people and programs with participatory involvement right from the beginning, which will lead to empowerment and ownership. Impartial role for all gender is attainable. We have attained this in Seychelles. A key lesson learned during disaster in Seychelles is that women's endurance and coping ability comes through stronger, hence their role and status in the community may be acknowledged. This is something that can and should happen in other countries with the same level of success, only if the political will is there, and the women themselves should be attentive to what is happening around them and take any kind of opportunity that presents themselves and use those opportunities to push their agenda. It is time to step out of the background and take a stand. As I conclude, let me say that Seychelles' effect of climate change the last few decades. So talking about the importance of gender perspective when working on disaster risk management and resilience building in the Seychelles context, I can proudly say that we currently have full participation of all people in the community when disaster strikes. We have the political will in our nation, regardless of gender, understand that everyone must come together if we are to tackle climate change and its consequence. We have an emergency brigade set up in every district, which can also operate at regional level if needs arise, coordinated by the district administrator. Seychelles has taken a right-based approach to climate change, where human rights value guides development and offer conceptual framework that has international human rights standards at its center, with the definite objective of accomplishing all human rights for all. The right-based approach analysis, obligation, inequality, and vulnerability, and and strive to redress discriminatory practice and unjust distribution of power. It anchors plans, policies, and programs in a system of rights and corresponding obligations established by international laws. Disaster can be an eye-opener on what a country lacks to make it stronger. Deals can be inclusive of introducing new laws and regulations that safeguard both gender correspondingly. When people are provided with hands-on information on disaster preparedness, the information will be put to good use. Male supremacy can be diplomatically overcome so that disaster preparedness can be pulled out of male sphere to render it gender neutral and create space to allow more participation of us women. All countries should have a democratic and participatory process in place. A shared leadership approach is more effective than personal leadership. I would end by saying this, a quote from a politician in the UK. Margaret Thatcher said, "If we want something said, ask a man. But if we want something done, ask a woman." If we want to do it, ladies, believe me, we can. All we need is to have the willpower to change mindset. It is an urgent matter. Let us start tackling it today, as tomorrow may be too late. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Esperon. So we are at the moment where we can start our Q&A session for questions and answers. I do ask to ensure that everyone gets a chance to speak, that each person only makes one question or one comment, and if possible, do try to limit that question or comment to 2 minutes or less, and try to ensure that it is solutions oriented, because that's really our goal with this panel. And if I might take the moderator's prerogative, I can go ahead and get us started. So my first question is for Mr. Nair. So you talked to us about the valuable work of the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hubs, and that really made me curious about what the current state of play is overall regarding gender mainstreaming for climate action, and especially gender-focused climate finance for enhanced climate action. What's the general state of play?
Yeah, so let me give an optimistic flavor to it, actually. So we have now, at least after COP26 and of course the following discussions, we have commitments coming up for climate finance to support member countries, actually, in various spheres. And when we look at the multilateral funding windows, many of the bigger windows like the Green Climate Fund and others have very specifically brought out windows for gender-specific financing, and also have mainstreamed the gender action planning and also the gender integration into the project proposals as a requirement, actually. So to say that there are result frameworks which are very clearly covering gender indicators right now, so that there is no proposal that goes without a gender marker which covers that. And of course, that's the bare minimum that we achieved till now. But there are, as other speakers talk, like we need transformative projects at scale, which requires huge investment. So, for example, we have a proposal for the Caribbean region, which is basically looking at large-scale financing at a regional scale for gender mainstreaming, especially on very natural resource-intensive sectors like agriculture, water management, etc. So there we go for a twin approach of first having a lot of individual entrepreneurial ventures coming into the action, and also in terms of setting up women-based institutional architecture which can sustain these efforts, because otherwise at many instances it just remains as kind of islands of successes, actually. So so basically the approach that we are following is proposals at regional scale, proposals at large scale in the country level, but of course parallelly supported by by a strong institutional structure to carry the proposals forward. But we have also seen that there are very, very good proposals that got approved but didn't take off in the last 6 months because of institutional bottlenecks there, actually. So those are some of the points that I would like to
Excellent. Thank you. It sounds like you have a very dynamic, multi-layered, holistic approach to financing from the top down to the bottom up. Very good. Thank you so much. My next question is actually for Dr. Khan. I was really intrigued by your use of the term climate proofing sexual and reproductive health. And I think I'll always remember that term, actually. So I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about, you're really good at drawing connections between climate change and gendered outcomes that aren't obvious and aren't clear to everyone. Could you discuss a little bit more in depth your work on implementing cross-cutting, cross-sectorial policies that connect these less obvious gender policies to climate change?
Thank you for that question. I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the work that Women Deliver is participating in. We're not leading it, and we're most certainly not the only people who are doing it. But there is starting to be a group of people who are starting to talk about the connections between sexual reproductive health and rights and climate justice. And starting to make those connections. There's actually a coalition that works on this, a number of different organizations of which we're a part of it. And what we're trying to do is actually build up the evidence base, because to convince decision makers and to get the agenda into large institutions and the speak of many other organizations, you have to build up the evidence base and making those connections. So that's one of the things we're trying to do is center girls and women and their lived experiences around access to sexual reproductive health services, the connections between the bodily autonomy, the full suite of those rights, and their increased resilience, or the negative impact of a reduction of those and their decreased resilience, which is a really important thing to speak about. And you spoke about how their resilience needs to be built in multiple different ways. And then we're trying to collaborate with a number of different organizations. Like I said, there's a group of people who are coming together and building a coalition to really to center the sort of grassroots grassroots advocates and those that represent marginalized and vulnerable communities, and center their advocacy on this issue. And I think that's the best way, where you can start to make those connections, where you have big decisions around, financing and funding going in, hearing from those communities and those representatives about what is the most important for them. How can we connect these needs and rights of girls and women around the globe to things like, inclusive financing, gender-focused financing, policy making, more localized disaster risk reduction, and ensure that their voices are centered in it, and to really ensure that we're not just talking about climate change from a systems level. We're not just talking about mitigation in the face of so many shocks and stresses that real people are facing on an everyday basis, and making sure that girls and women are part of that discussion. They're centered in the considerations, and it's not a gender blind or even I forgot the other word. Gender blind and
Gender neutral?
Yeah, gender neutral.
That's why I'm here.
Of course, I'm sitting on the stage and I forget it. My apologies. Of course, gender neutral approach, but that it's a very, very gendered focused one. They're gonna kick me out of my job. I forgot that word. Good gosh. But yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. And my last question is actually to Honorable Esperon. So when I'm thinking about island states, right, we know that one of the most powerful ways to galvanize climate change initiatives is to link them to GDP. Right, that hits really hard for a lot of developing countries. So I was wondering if you could speak either on behalf of Seychelles or all island states and speak a little bit about the economic or GDP dynamics of gender inequality and climate change in countries like yours, specifically those that are reliant on tourism.
Thank you for the question. Yes, Seychelles is an island, a group of islands, right in the middle of the Indian Ocean, as I as I said at the beginning. And our bread and butter is from the tourism sector, mostly. So, you know, when tourists come to Seychelles, the main attraction is the beaches. They want to go at sea, they want to be near the beach. And we have a lot of tourism establishments near the beaches. But with the changes that is happening, there is a risk that if we keep on building close to the coastal line, at some point, it would be washed away. We would be in the same situation as Maldives, where the low-lying islands would be washed away. So in the planning itself, we have to be very conscious that we have to push back a bit. And this is, you should bear in mind that when giving planning permission to build tourism establishment close to the coastal line, we should be aware that there is the rise in sea level that may affect. So it has to be pushed back a bit. And where it's concerned, coral bleaching also. We were affected some years back by coral bleaching because of the main activities that go on at sea. And when tourists come to Seychelles, they want to go scuba diving, they want to go on the sea, you see? And if we are not conscious of the changes that are happening and to find a way of mitigating it, it would be very difficult for us.
Of course, very poignant. Thank you so much. So with that, I would now like to open the floor, and any delegate or attendee is welcome to pose a question or a comment. And I think we have a roaming mic that's being shared. The first hand up, I saw the Honorable former President of Mauritius is the first to take the mic.
Thank you very much for giving the opportunity to raise this issue. One couple of words I haven't heard in the course of this panel is climate injustice. And we are the Commonwealth. We are 54 countries. Most of the countries in the Commonwealth, they are countries that are being impacted by climate change, and they're not producers of greenhouse gas emission. Many African countries, and those to be impacted most will be the island countries, like mine, like the Seychelles, and the other countries as well. Now, I hope that in the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting later this week, we'll talk about the financing. I mean, we know this is embedded that we are going to look at women issues. We know that women are most impacted. We know that women are going to be the agent of change. But what about the finance gap increasingly talk about, the Green Fund? And is this group going to take this up in terms of addressing the financing? That's one thing. The other thing that we talk about is what are the adaptation measures? I'm not going to draw the parallel with the vaccine inequity, but we are saying the same thing in terms of accessing the appropriate technologies that will help smaller countries, more vulnerable access in order to be able to adapt. And this is completely out of the equation. The third comment I would like to make is we increasingly hear the notion of political will. Who is going to distill the political will? Because this is precisely what is lacking in the international dialogue, in the international narrative, about the political will in order to make things happen. We know what the problems are. We know that the major problem with climate is essentially emission. And yet, this is where there is lack of political will to address the core issue, which is reducing emission. Up until we don't tackle this up front, unfortunately, most of our dialogue around climate will become redundant because this is the major cause of the problem. And unfortunately, as CHOGM, as a group of Commonwealth countries, we are going to be more the victims than anything else. Thank you.
I saw a hand over here first in the white shirt. Yes, please stand up.
Yeah. Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Claudine Wera. I'm the Minister of State in charge of planning in Rwanda. Thank you very much, all of you, for those really good presentations, especially on this interesting topic on gender and the climate change. Starting by yourself, moderator, and linking what you presented in the introduction and the question you asked about the link between climate change and the GDP. This is really a very important question, and that comes to respond to one of the statements you make by saying that many people value immediate just benefits and maybe might feel kind of uncertainty when it comes to the future. This is really true. But for me, it's not a question. I was wondering whether maybe this might not be linked to the lack of information, especially environmental statistics, that help us just to value our nature and the environment, and just to be able just to come up with a net present value that help us to subtract from the all economy benefits from any investment we make, and also just try to just to see or to estimate this environmental cost associated by those developments as well. In Rwanda, we started we're one of the pioneer countries implementing what we call the natural capital accounting program, and this program just has the purpose just to come up with those environmental statistics just to help us to discount, as you mentioned, that it's really difficult for most people just to discount for the future. But by having those environmental statistics, those information, maybe we may be able even to come up with this green GDP and be able just to link this climate change and the GDP. Maybe you may need to do a reflection on that as well, so to elaborate more. So the second one is about just a presenter on the head of climate change. He presented something really very important on the climate finance. So, and what was really most important in that just was to link this climate finance and the gender mainstreaming. In Rwanda, we're trying to raise those climate finance. We're trying to really to come up with good proposals and the green project that really attract investors. But when it comes to linking climate finance and gender mainstreaming, I have impression maybe that countries might really need just to come up with good skills or just good, understanding when it comes to any parameters that help us just to link those climate finance and try to just to understand better this link between gender equality and higher climate impact. So what do you think about that? What can we learn from those those countries that successfully raised those climate finance by linking this green finance with the gender mainstreaming? Thank you, Moderator.
I'll respond first and then I'll hand it over to you. Thank you. And you make such a good point about access to information. And as we attempt to decolonize climate change resiliency, the theme of this CHOGM is about the digital divide, right? So I teach economics, as you can probably guess. And so any CBA, a cost-benefit analysis that anyone does, is only as strong as the information that the person doing the CBA has access to, right? Dr. Khan already, I think, referenced information asymmetry and how it leads to bad outcomes. And then yesterday, in the Violence Against Women and Girls panel, one of the panelists said something really poignant, and she said, that which is not measured is not acted upon. And that really stuck with me, and that speaks to everything we're discussing at CHOGM. And if I can actually self-promote a little bit, I just finished a climate change and COVID study with Malawian universities along with Glasgow Caledonian in Scotland, and we were looking at the way that climate change and COVID impact women in Malawi and Rwanda. And what we found out is that it's not just that these women don't have a quantity of information about climate change, it's that they had bad information, they had misinformation, they had information that had not been translated into Kinyarwanda or Quechua or other indigenous languages. So with the internet, we are empowered to know more about climate change than we ever have in human history, but that also means people are vulnerable to an unforeseen amount of misinformation about climate change, right? So it's an issue of quantity and quality, to your point. So I think one of our initiatives collectively is to not just increase accessible information about climate change to people on all ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, but to interrogate and audit that information and make sure that it's reliable so they can make good CBAs, right? If I can pass on to Mr. Nair.
Thank you for that intervention, and thanks for those comments made. So specifically on the Rwandan question, in terms of the experience, I think as Climate Finance Access Hub, we approach proposals, especially transformative proposals, from two angles. One is to look at concrete climate change adaptation and mitigation proposals having a transformative impact on gender in a particular country. That's one approach. The second approach is to look at existing policies and programs of the government, actually, and how do you integrate gender mainstreaming and climate. So it's like the climate proofing. So it's basically to top up to your existing climate programs or the existing development programs, and to bring the element of climate action into it, so that the gender mainstreaming happens effectively. Because if you look at many programs of the countries, including like the drinking water supply programs or agriculture subsidy program, or the agriculture management programs within the production system, or even post-harvest, how many policies, like how many countries do have policies that are very focused gender mainstreaming integrated into that with climate consideration? That's the complexity, actually. So yeah, gender mainstreaming is in many proposals or in many programs, but linking that to the climate extremes and then linking that to the financing needs, that makes your costs pretty high, actually. So the climate proofing as an exercise, that's a tool actually being used at different levels, which actually gives you an estimate in terms of what is the additionality that is involved in acting. And that gives you a clear estimate in terms of how much additional finance you need to ensure your programs are climate proofed and that it can deliver climate action, especially for gender mainstreaming. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Can I say something?
Oh, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The issue brought up by ex-president of Mauritius is a real issue. I remember at COP26, even in the side meeting that Commonwealth organized, the issue of political will was a hot topic for debate, because it's true that the action of the developed countries are affecting us small island states. And I do hope that the subject is brought up again in tomorrow's meeting of small island states, and we can press for action. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. And I see an eager hand in the second row.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Dr. Stem Sonyoni, the Minister of Women Affairs, Community, Small and Medium Enterprises from Zimbabwe. I want to thank the panelists. This is one of the most important topics, I think, to humanity. Madam Moderator, I've had a lot of experience in working with rural and grassroots development, not only in my country, Zimbabwe, but also in Bangladesh and other African countries. A lot has been achieved to uplift the vulnerable communities. But unfortunately, due to climate change, some of the communities are becoming poorer and poorer. And I would like us to really look at this topic very seriously. And globally, I was moved myself when I read an article that the glacier, which was formed over 2,000 years, has melted only within 25 years, indicating that there may be a global shortage of drinking water. And coming to my situation, I think we need to when we talk of gender, we need to realize we're talking of men and women, girls and boys. In my situation, the village where I come from as a member of parliament, the communities there have really suffered from the global change. The water shortage is real. The water table has gone down so that the wells have dried up. So I'm talking about a real situation where I come from. So the women used to fetch water on their heads back to the homes. Now they are no longer able to do so because the water has to be drawn from deeper boreholes further away, 7 to 15 kilometers away. So as a result, you find that it is no longer the girls and the women that are fetching water in my community. It is now the boys and the men that the boys are pulled out of school to head cattle towards the nearest water point, which could be about 7 to 15 kilometers away. And they also have to harness scotch carts to fetch water in drums. So we have villages like that. And therefore, it is the boy child now who is suffering, not necessarily the girl child alone. The girls are going to school while the boys are going to head cattle. And therefore, we need to look at gender as gender, both men and women, both girls and boys. And let me come to solutions. In my community, we have managed to educate people not to cut down trees and not to burn the veldt. And I'm glad to report that we have been very successful. In my constituency, nobody burns the veldt. We have indigenous forests, thriving, and we are not cutting down trees unnecessarily. Also, government has found drilling rigs that will go up to 500 meters, because you can't get water at less than 100 meters anymore. We used to go up to 20, 30, 40 meters, but now you have to go beyond 100 meters. So government has found drilling rigs that can go up to 500 meters. So I want to conclude by saying the solutions, like you said, Madam Moderator, is not about to think about today. It is to think about the future. And the future lies in us holding hands, West and South, and Africa and the globe. Let us, wherever we are standing, what are we doing to prevent climate change? From the West, what are the products that we can boycott, whose production is causing climate change? And from the South, some of the solutions is what I've proffered. Where I stand, there is nobody burning veldt, there is nobody cutting trees unnecessarily. Let us all join hands to find prevention, solutions, and move together, because this is really a do or die for our communities. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe two more. I'll try to squeeze in 3 more, depending on the hands that come up. I see three hands in a row right over there, and they all went up at the same time. So I don't dare choose. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My name is Olive Wamaria. I'm part of the Feminist Forum from Rwanda. I want to talk about something that has just been talked about very shortly, but I want to emphasize it. Today, we talk about 100 companies, multinational companies, that are responsible for more than 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a conversation I'm not hearing here. Why is not the private sector, the business, involved in this conversation? And yet we know they have a big role to play. We have our governments that have invited these companies to come and invest and really build our communities. But what they are doing is that they are destroying the lands, and they are destroying the people, and they are destroying the health, with irreversible consequences, health consequences of women and girls particularly. And they are also being exploited. We know how much these companies are exploiting women's labor and their bodies with nothing in return. So what are we doing about it? I would like us to, as we talk about personal and collective responsibility, what is the Commonwealth really doing to hold these companies accountable? As we talk about private-public partnerships, how do we ensure that they are really held accountable and we are really preventing these issues from happening, as opposed to actually being told that as a human being, I should be a responsible consumer, or I should be responsible. Yet we know there is a lot more responsibility that these companies and our governments that have given doors to these companies to do. So my take on this is that what is the Commonwealth doing really, and how do we ensure that, as the previous speaker just said, that we are preventing these issues from happening, we are boycotting the products that they are producing, because we know they're destroying our Mother Earth and the people that inhabit it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent point about corporate social responsibility. Next hand up.
I see you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My name is Esther Mubalama Bizuri. I'm from DRC. I'm a student. My question is related to the access of information. I want to know, how can we explain to illiterate women and girls in our villages on issues or problem of climate change? Thank you.
Dr. Khan, in your work, maybe working with communities on sexual and reproductive health, maybe you know of some strategies for translating knowledge at the local level?
I mean, I frankly don't think we need to explain to them the problems of climate change. I mean, as the Honourable Minister remarked, and as our Honourable Panelists remarked, these communities are facing it every day. So if you go to a village or a town or a city, I don't want to just, fetishize this whole rural village woman thing. I think they recognize their localized impacts more than anyone else can recognize the localized impacts. You don't have to go and explain to them, the impact of the wells going down, or the trees being cut, them not having fuel wood, or the shores being eroded and them not being able to get their main source of income from tourism. So on the other hand, I don't think that the common person, me, you, the woman in a village in DRC, needs to understand the total complexity of the whole climate change, sort of cycle and sequence, and the mitigation and the solutions to it. For them, it is what they're facing in terms of the shocks and stresses that they're seeing every day in their life, the deterioration of their general well-being, their health and well-being of their children and their families. To me, it is very, very important that we go and understand what their lived experiences are in that particular instance. It might be that boys now have to go and fetch water and they're being pulled out of school. It might be that the fishing industry or the tourism industry in a particular place is going down. And connecting to the point that was first made by Madam President, which is that we then have to focus not on obviously there has to be mitigation and all of those things, but really focus on climate justice, where, and this is what I said right at the beginning of my comments, that the people who are contributing the least are suffering the most, and this goes for whoever it might be. Thank you.
And I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions or comments. And I'm so sorry, this side of the room, you're under the brightest light, which is why really I can't see your hands. So I'm just going to have to trust the roaming mic to choose you for me. Please, whoever. Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak and ask a question, as well as a challenge and a plea to all of us. We are gathered here as leaders in our own circles, and much as we are leaders in our own circles, we have issues before us. The elephant in the house is climate change, and we all agree that we have an elephant in the house. But maybe the question would be, at times we make pledges. We come to meetings like these ones, recommendations are made, and one of the pledges, as I agree with that sister who stood before me, mentioning about the culprits, companies, even rich nations that pledged funding as regards climate justice. The question is, Commonwealth is a very good and opportune platform for us to pursue such a matter. The question is, what is it that we are doing as Commonwealth, as leaders, as regards to ensure that the culprits pay the price, pay the pledge? For example, the $100 billion. Who is going to police such a thing to be done? Thank you very much.
Thank you much for that comment. And if I might use a term there, I believe it's Pavlovian tax, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is a tax that companies or corporations must pay for the social ills caused by their operations. And I think Pavlovian taxes are wildly underused in climate change management. Okay, maybe one more from this side of the room.
I'm Mathanal Kenge. I work with EcoBricks, a recycling company in Uganda, and Tier Fund. Young people, we are all, sorry, I was in the youth. We women and as young people, we are ready, more ready. But more funds would mean more scale and more good and more green jobs. I'm going to read, but I'm shivering. We can handle that. As a climate finance champion, I would like to call upon all activists in this room, under this body, the Commonwealth Women Forum. We call upon the wealth nations to honor their $100 billion pledge to the vulnerable nations for the loss and the damage. I think climate finance is the answer to solve the climate crisis we are facing. I'm going to go back to quote one of the pen out what she said. Let's start today because tomorrow we'll be late. Madam Moderator, would you allow me post you the summary of the letter that states the $100 billion pledge, please, as we go to the next question.
Sure, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood. You want to read a letter?
No, to pass it to you. I have it written.
Oh, sure. Oh, physically. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much.
I would appreciate that. Thank you. Great. Thank you. And we have time for one more, and then we will wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really been an interesting session. I'm Ogogwa Osiobu. I'm a geriatrician with the Geriatric Association of Nigeria and the Stakeholders Group on Aging Africa. I'm happy that we've mentioned here today that climate change is a human rights issue. And Dr. Khan, I really like the way you've linked health issues as well. And also the fact that you mentioned that those who are more affected are those who have contributed the least to what we're experiencing today. And I want to bring our attention to the older women. They make up about 5 to, at the most, 20% of any population. But when we have this climate change stresses and shocks, be it the hurricane, the heat waves, they tend to have the greater impact on their physical health, mental health, and even mortality can be as high as 40% and more. So are we looking into the needs of these older adults, the impact on these older women? Secondly, they have knowledge and experience from their localities, their communities, that they can bring to the table in coming up with policies and strategies for disaster risk mitigation. So what I would really like to see is that we're bringing all the women groups to the table for the conversations. We're bringing human rights institutions to the table for the conversation so that we have an age-friendly, all-inclusive strategy, be it for policy formulation, housing, building resilience for housing, or even healthcare, so that it's all inclusive and everyone is involved. while fingers are not necessarily equal, it is necessary that we all cooperate so we can get this issue done with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent last comment on inclusivity to end the panel on. That was a lovely last note. So I always feel terrible when not everybody gets a chance to speak. So what I would love to do is, Natalie, if I'm correct, I think we're now at a point where we take a refreshments break. And so if I could, I would love to encourage that this conversation continues as we take our refreshments break, and let's galvanize this momentum to keep talking off stage if we could. And with that, I would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists for their time and everyone here for their engagement. Thank you so much, and let's continue this conversation.
We want a group photo, panel photo. Not for the panel, you know. You got the panel photo? Here in front.
Great. So I want to just thank so much our moderator for managing a very interesting session. Can we give her a round of applause as well as our speakers? Thank you so much. So quickly before we go to, everybody standing up, but I have not said go. So I am confused about where we're headed. Have a seat, please. Thank you. As the moderators as the panel takes a picture, I wanted to go over some quick housekeeping, and I would encourage you to continue the discussion. A very quick point, I think it's very important for us to come away specifically later with the outcomes of this forum, with very concrete things that we can do to avoid us doing the regular pledges that that don't get done. So please, let's think about what concrete things we're going to come out with at the outcomes level. So a couple of announcements. As I said, we're going to refreshments. After that, we're going to have 2 parallel sessions. The first one in the main ballroom here, Human Capital Development, Building Girl Leaders of Tomorrow, moderated by Professor Asha Kanwar, CEO and President of the Commonwealth of Learning, as well as Addressing Barriers to Gender Equality and Women Empowerment. That's going to be in the auditorium that will be moderated by Dr. Shavana Haythorne-Thwaite of the Commonwealth Secretariat. That will start at 11:30 sharp. That means that it gives you, so as an educator, let me tell you what we do with our students. I won't speak until you stop speaking, and then we can go have coffee. So if I can get your attention, then we can go have coffee. Very well. Okay, very quickly, those who are looking for tap and go cards to go around Kigali, they're downstairs if you would like to get that for yourself. As I said, we're not coming back here. You won't see me again. We're going to have lunch, after which we're going to go into 2 parallel sessions, one on cervical cancer and one on the peace in the Commonwealth. The one in the peace in the Commonwealth will be downstairs in the auditorium led by Mark Albin, and the one here on cervical cancer will be moderated by Dr. Miriam Mutebi. So after lunch, you can come up here or downstairs, depending on the topic of interest. And now we can break. I wanted also to acknowledge the Honorable Minister from Zimbabwe. I mentioned all the countries except Zimbabwe, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you so much and enjoy the networking break. Thank you.